Dawn broke over northern France beneath a shroud of pale fog. The countryside was quiet, except for the slow rumble of diesel engines. A German supply column, trucks, fuel tankers, and horse-drawn wagons, moved cautiously along a narrow road, bordered by wheat fields and shattered trees. The men were tired, unshaven, hollow-eyed from nights without sleep. They believed the sky was clear. Then a distant thunder began to grow, a low, rolling sound that didn't belong to weather. The drivers looked up. Through the mist, sunlight caught the metallic flash of wings. A second later, the sound erupted into a roar. 8 50-caliber guns opened fire. Tracers tore through the haze, ripping into the convoy below. Explosions split the quiet morning as trucks burst into flame. Ammunition ignited, and men dove for cover that no longer existed. High above, the P-47 Thunderbolts curved away. Massive, unshaken, engines howling like gods of war. That morning, German crews would learn a terrifying truth. The battlefield no longer belonged to them. It now belonged to the sky, and to America's Thunderbolt. By 1943, the balance of air power in Europe had begun to tilt decisively toward the Allies. What had started as a slow and costly campaign to penetrate Fortress Europe, from the air was now transforming into something far greater. A coordinated assault from the skies that would strangle Germany's ability to fight on the ground. The U.S. Army Air Forces had learned hard lessons. The daylight bombing raids over occupied France and the Ruhr had proven both their courage and their vulnerability. But behind the bombers, a new kind of weapon was taking shape, one that would change how the Allies fought the war. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. It was enormous for a fighter, nearly twice the weight of its British counterparts. It carried the unmistakable growl of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower engine that could drag its thick fuselage to altitudes of 30,000 feet and still dive faster than anything the Luftwaffe could field. The Germans would soon give it a name, Der Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolt. Originally designed for high-altitude escort and interception, the P-47 was never meant to duel tanks or convoys. Yet, as the war evolved, so did its mission. By mid-1943, Allied strategists recognized a grim truth. To defeat the Wehrmacht, they had to break its supply veins. The German army depended on endless lines of trucks, trains, and fuel convoys stretching from France to the Eastern Front. Bombers could strike factories, but only fighters could hunt down the arteries feeding the front lines. Enter the P-47, built like a flying tank. It could absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Its 8 Browning 50-caliber machine guns unleashed a wall of lead capable of tearing through armored vehicles, locomotives, and entire troop columns. With pylons under its wings, it carried bombs and rockets, turning a high-altitude escort fighter into a ruthless ground attack weapon. In 1943, American fighter groups stationed in England began to experiment with low-altitude attack runs against rail lines and truck convoys in northern France. These missions were dangerous. The pilots flew so low they could see the faces of German soldiers below. Every mission demanded precision, nerve, and speed. One pilot later described it as racing death with both hands on the throttle. For the German ground forces, this was a new and horrifying enemy. The Luftwaffe, stretched thin and outnumbered, could no longer protect every convoy. Supply officers and truck drivers who once feared partisans now feared the American jugs roaring in from the clouds. Even a single Thunderbolt could set a road ablaze in seconds. The shift became visible by early 1944. Across occupied France, wrecked vehicles littered the roads. Entire transport battalions refused to move during daylight. Commanders began to issue desperate orders. Move only at night. Camouflage everything. Scatter convoys. But even the night wasn't safe for long. Allied radar and reconnaissance mapped every route, and the Thunderbolts waited for dawn. Behind this transformation was an industrial miracle. America's factories were churning out P-47s at an astonishing rate, nearly one every hour by late 1943. Replacement parts, engines, and ammunition flowed seamlessly across the Atlantic. For every aircraft the Germans lost, America built 3 more. Meanwhile, Germany's logistics were crumbling. Oil shortages, destroyed bridges, and relentless bombing of rail junctions forced supply lines to shrink. The Wehrmacht's once fluid mobility began to stall. In the West, field commanders begged for air cover that never came. And in that vacuum, the Thunderbolt became king. It was more than just a machine. It was a statement of American might, engineering, and endurance. The pilots who flew them weren't aristocrats or seasoned veterans. Many were young men barely out of training, flying heavy fighters that required muscle to maneuver and instinct to survive. But with every mission, they refined their craft, turning the P-47 into the deadliest tool of close air support the world had yet seen. By the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the P-47 had already rewritten the rules of the battlefield. It wasn't simply destroying targets, it was dismantling Germany's capacity to move, resupply, and reinforce, and as the invasion loomed, the Thunderbolt's true purpose was about to be revealed. By May 1944, the Western Front was on the brink of eruption. In southern England, thousands of aircraft filled the airfields, fighters, bombers, transports, and gliders, waiting for the order that would launch the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord was not just a test of courage. It was a test of logistics, coordination, and control of the skies. For that, the Allies turned to the Thunderbolt. While the P-51 Mustang would later become famous for escorting bombers deep into Germany, it was the P-47 that bore the brunt of the day-to-day work over France. The 9th Air Force's fighter-bomber groups trained relentlessly for one role: to crush the German army's ability to move. They were the hammer that would shatter the enemy's backbone before the troops even landed on Normandy's beaches. To prepare, Allied intelligence and reconnaissance mapped every bridge, depot, and rail line across northern France. Convoy routes were identified. Fuel dumps were marked. Even the smallest crossroads were noted for destruction. Nothing that carried supplies to the front would be allowed to survive. On the German side, life for convoy crews grew increasingly desperate. Supply truck drivers, once anonymous soldiers in the machinery of war, now carried out their duties under constant threat from above. They were trained to recognize the sound of different aircraft engines, but the P-47's radial roar stood apart, a deep, growling thunder that meant death was seconds away. They learned to scatter, to brake hard, to leap from cabs and dive into ditches. Yet no amount of camouflage could protect them from a pilot who could see every shimmer of sunlight off a windshield or every plume of smoke from an exhaust. A single strafing run could destroy an entire column. The Allies called these rhubarb missions. Small groups of Thunderbolts would sweep across occupied territory, flying barely above the treetops, hunting targets of opportunity. Bridges, locomotives, trucks, anything that moved or glinted was fair game. They struck fast, with no warning, often before German crews could reach their machine guns. These missions were as perilous as they were effective. Flying low meant exposure to small arms fire, flak, and telephone wires. Pilots often returned to base with their wings punctured and their fuselages torn. But for every aircraft that didn't return, dozens of German vehicles never moved again. The German High Command quickly understood the gravity of this new threat. Reports from field commanders in France painted a grim picture. Transport units unable to deliver fuel or ammunition. Tank battalions stranded for lack of gasoline. Bridges reduced to rubble minutes after repair. General Alfred Jodl himself admitted that Allied air power had made daytime movement virtually impossible. By June 6, 1944, the day the first Allied troops stormed Normandy's beaches, the Thunderbolts were already writing their legend. They didn't just protect the invasion. They enabled it. Roads leading to the coast were clogged with wrecked German vehicles. Reinforcements were delayed, sometimes by days, because convoys couldn't move without being annihilated. From the first hours of D-Day, Thunderbolts struck along every approach to the beaches. Columns attempting to move toward Caen, Carentan, and Saint-Lô were ripped apart before they could even reach the front. The Luftwaffe, depleted and overwhelmed, could do nothing but watch as its ground forces were pounded into dust. By midsummer, the P-47 had become a symbol of dread. German soldiers gave it another nickname: Der Schlachter, the Butcher. They spoke of its invulnerability, its terrifying dive, its unstoppable guns. To the Americans, it was affectionately called the Jug. Heavy, reliable, and unbreakable, like the nation that built it. And as the Allies pushed deeper into France, the German supply network began to collapse entirely. Fuel shortages became chronic. Armored divisions were stranded. Communication lines fractured. The battlefield that once moved with the speed of blitzkrieg was now paralyzed under a constant hail of lead from the skies. The age of air dominance had arrived, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was its engine. But the true scale of its impact, the scenes that would leave German crews staring in disbelief, were still to come. Every great weapon of war carries with it not just power, but philosophy, a reflection of the nation that built it. The P-47 Thunderbolt embodied America's approach to the Second World War: overwhelming force, mechanical resilience, and industrial precision. The technological angle, the machine that shouldn't have flown. The Thunderbolt was not graceful. It was not sleek like the Spitfire or agile like the Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was a brute, a flying fortress disguised as a fighter. At over 7 tons fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-seat fighter of the war. Yet, through engineering genius, it became a symbol of endurance. Its heart was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000-horsepower radial engine built to withstand punishment. Air-cooled, with a massive turbo supercharger mounted in the rear fuselage, it could operate at high altitude without losing power. When hit, it didn't bleed coolant or oil like German inline engines. It kept running, coughing black smoke, but refusing to die. Pilots often joked that the P-47 didn't fly. It charged through the air. Its immense weight gave it momentum that turned dives into deadly plunges. Once it began descending on a target, few enemies survived the run. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns spat nearly 100 rounds per second. A 2-second burst could turn a Panzer or a convoy truck into molten metal. Add to that its payload capacity, up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or Tandy rockets, and the P-47 transformed. From a fighter into a flying artillery piece, it was the perfect hybrid, part interceptor, part tank destroyer. The tactical angle, turning the sky into the battlefield before 1943, fighter planes were seen primarily as tools to gain air superiority, to protect bombers, duel enemy fighters, and clear the skies. But as Allied commanders studied the stalemate on the ground, they realized the front could be broken not by sheer manpower, but by isolating the enemy from his supplies. The P-47 was made for that task. American pilots developed new methods of attack that blurred the line between air and ground warfare. Rhubarb and Ranger missions were flown at treetop height, where the horizon rushed past at 400 miles per hour. Thunderbolts hunted trains, tanks, and troop columns in packs, communicating over shortwave radios and striking with terrifying coordination. Each pilot was trained to identify targets instantly, to distinguish a fuel truck from a decoy, a locomotive from a boxcar filled with civilians. The discipline was surgical, even amid chaos. Their goal was not random destruction. It was strategic paralysis. The P-47's survivability allowed pilots to take risks few others dared. They could absorb flak hits, return home with holes the size of fists in their wings, even fly hundreds of miles on damaged engines. One Thunderbolt reportedly landed safely, with an entire cylinder blown off. That kind of resilience gave its pilots confidence, a confidence the Germans quickly learned to fear. The human angle, the men behind the machine. Most of the pilots who flew Thunderbolts were barely in their 20s. Many had never been overseas before. They came from farms, small towns, and cities across America. To them, the war was both duty and spectacle, a test of will in the open sky. They called themselves jug jockeys, proud of the machine's unrefined strength. Their missions were grueling. 3, sometimes 4 sorties per day, each lasting barely an hour but demanding every ounce of concentration. At low altitude, they faced a torrent of small arms fire, flak bursts, and the ever-present risk of clipping a tree or power line. Some carried small Lucky Charms in their cockpits. Others painted nose art, fierce tigers, eagles, and pin-up girls, a touch of humanity in a world of destruction. Their bravery didn't stem from recklessness. It came from discipline. They trusted the Thunderbolt, and in turn, it protected them. Many pilots would later credit the aircraft's rugged design for saving their lives dozens of times. "It could take a beating," one veteran said, "and still bring you home on one wing and a prayer." Every mission written in their flight logs was more than a number. It was a step closer to liberation. Each destroyed convoy meant fewer bullets fired at Allied troops. Each bridge reduced to rubble meant fewer German tanks reaching Normandy. In the air, they felt untouchable. On the ground, the Germans felt hunted, and soon, that feeling would turn into panic. The enemy's perspective. Shock, disbelief, and helplessness for German soldiers on the ground. The war had once been about precision and control. Blitzkrieg had relied on coordination. Armor, infantry, and supply columns moving in rhythm. But by 1944, that rhythm was shattered. When the P-47s appeared, there was no warning. The first sign was usually a sound, a deep, rolling growl like distant thunder. Then came the specks in the sky, diving almost vertically, sunlight flashing off their wings. The German flak gunners would scramble to load their 20mm cannons, but it was always too late. A typical convoy might face 4 or 5 Thunderbolts attacking in succession. The first would strafe with machine guns, the second drop fragmentation bombs, the third unleash rockets, and the fourth finish what was left. The chaos was total. Roads turned into firestorms, tires and oil tanks ignited, sending black plumes that could be seen for miles. For those who survived, the shock was psychological as much as physical. Many reported hearing the P-47's engines in their dreams, a sound associated with hopelessness. German officers wrote in their diaries about the iron monsters of the air that destroyed columns faster than they could be rebuilt. In the field hospitals, men spoke of the Thunderbolts as invincible. "Even when we hit them," one anti-aircraft gunner recalled, "they did not fall. They came back again." It was a demoralizing truth. Technology and numbers were no longer on Germany's side. The industrial angle, factories as front lines behind. Every mission flown in France stood a continent of production. The American war machine operated on a scale that Germany could neither match nor comprehend. The Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, New York, worked day and night, turning out nearly 15,000 Thunderbolts by the war's end. Women built the wings, engines, and guns, an army of mechanics in coveralls, each rivet contributing to the destruction of Nazi supply lines thousands of miles away. The Thunderbolt's parts came from dozens of states, engines from Connecticut, radios from Ohio, bullets from Illinois. It was a war fought not just by soldiers, but by a nation unified through industry. Germany, by contrast, was bleeding resources. Its factories were bombed daily, its railways in ruins, its oil supply evaporating. To replace every tank destroyed in France, it needed fuel, steel, and manpower that no longer existed. The Thunderbolt wasn't just winning battles in the sky, it was the physical embodiment of America's ability to outbuild, outlast, and outfly its enemy. Every new aircraft that rolled off the assembly line was another nail in the coffin of German mobility. The strategic angle, breaking the war machine by mid-1944, German generals began to understand that their enemy had mastered a new kind of warfare. It wasn't about capturing land alone. It was about denying movement. The Thunderbolts, working alongside British Typhoons and American Mustangs, formed a lethal network of aerial interdiction. They didn't wait for battles to reach the front lines. They went after the arteries that fed those battles: rail depots, fuel convoys, and bridge crossings. One report from the German 7th Army described entire divisions unable to move during daylight hours. When they tried, P-47s appeared as if called by radio from the heavens. In reality, Allied reconnaissance planes and forward observers were guiding the strikes with remarkable precision. This constant pressure had a profound ripple effect. Artillery units lacked ammunition. Armored regiments ran dry on fuel. Field kitchens couldn't deliver food. Even communication trucks were destroyed, forcing commands to be relayed on foot. The Wehrmacht's greatest strength, its coordination, disintegrated. By August 1944, the German High Command admitted that the front has ceased to exist as a continuous line. It was here that the P-47's legacy was solidified. No longer just a fighter or bomber, it became a force multiplier, a weapon that multiplied the efficiency of every Allied soldier on the ground. Infantry advanced faster, tank crews met less resistance, and supply routes opened wide. What began as isolated airstrikes had become a full-scale collapse of German logistics. And at the heart of it all were the men flying the Thunderbolts, patrolling the skies over France, transforming warfare with every pass of their guns. But the true test of the P-47's power, and the moment that left German crews staring in disbelief, would come at one of the most decisive moments of the entire European campaign, the closing of the Falaise Pocket. The Falaise Trap, Germany's final collapse in France, August 1944. The war in France had reached its breaking point. German forces, retreating from Normandy after D-Day, were caught in a tightening noose. Allied ground troops pushed from the west and south, while from the air, P-47 Thunderbolts circled like predators above a dying army. The retreating columns stretched for miles. Trucks, tanks, wagons, and horses, all trapped between the towns of Falaise, Chambois, and Argentan. It was a scene of desperation. Soldiers threw away rifles to run faster. Commanders tried to organize convoys under cover of darkness. But dawn was their enemy, because when the sun rose, the sky roared. The P-47 pilots called it the turkey shoot. To the Germans below, it was hell. From 10,000 feet up, the Thunderbolts began their attack runs. Each pilot carried bombs, rockets, and 8 50-caliber machine guns, enough firepower to shred armored columns. They came in waves. First, bombs exploded on bridges and crossroads, trapping vehicles in gridlock. Then came the rocket salvos, trails of white smoke streaking into convoys, turning tanks into twisted metal. Finally, the strafing runs, low, savage bursts that ripped through anything still moving. Smoke and flames filled the valley. The smell of burning rubber, fuel, and flesh hung in the air for days. German officers later described it as a slaughterhouse under open sky. Horses panicked, overturned carts blocked the roads, and men crawled into ditches, covering their heads with their arms as the thunderbolts swooped again and again. From above, the pilots could barely believe what they saw. You couldn't miss, one remembered. It was like shooting at a highway jammed with targets. Another described seeing bodies running in every direction, the whole earth moving under fire. In just a few days, over 10,000 German vehicles were destroyed in and around the Falaise pocket. Tanks were blown apart, half-tracks left burning, artillery pieces split in half. Whole divisions ceased to exist. The Thunderbolts' role was decisive, not just in destroying equipment, but in crushing morale. Every attempt to break out was spotted from the air and annihilated. By the time the ground forces arrived to seal the pocket, what they found was carnage on an unimaginable scale. The Allies captured over 50,000 prisoners and counted tens of thousands of enemy dead. The German Seventh Army was wiped out. One British general later said, "It was the end of the German army in France." For the men who flew the P-47s, it was victory, but not a joyful one. They had seen too much. "We were proud," a pilot from the 362nd Fighter Group said. But after Falaise, proud doesn't mean happy. We'd turned the battlefield into a graveyard. The turning point, air power redefined. The Falaise pocket was more than just a battle. It was proof that control of the air meant control of the war. The Thunderbolt had shown that air superiority wasn't about dogfights anymore. It was about domination from above, about shaping the battlefield before a single ground soldier arrived. For Germany, it marked the end of mobility. Every movement became a risk, every road a potential death trap. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, could do nothing but watch its army die from the sky. For the Allies, the battle validated their strategy of air interdiction. The concept, cutting enemy supply lines from the air, had worked beyond expectation. It was now the blueprint for modern warfare. After Falaise, German forces retreated east in disarray. France was liberated within weeks. The road to Paris opened wide, and the world saw what happened when an empire that thrived on movement was brought to a halt. And at the center of that transformation stood the P-47 Thunderbolt, a machine once dismissed as too heavy, too slow, too crude, but now recognized as one of the most devastating warplanes ever built. Its power didn't come just from its guns or bombs, but from the men who flew it, young, fearless, often exhausted, yet relentless. They had turned engineering into strategy, and strategy into survival. By August's end, the war in Western Europe had changed forever. The German army would never recover, and the P-47 had become a legend. The Hunters in the Sky, Life and Death in the Thunderbolt. By late August 1944, Allied command knew the sky belonged to them. Yet for the pilots of the P-47 Thunderbolt, every sortie was still a brush with death. The German flak gunners, desperate and cornered, filled the air with steel. Black puffs of smoke dotted the horizon as thunderbolts screamed through, engines roaring at full throttle. Inside the cockpit, the world was chaos and vibration. The pilot's seat shook violently as he dove toward a convoy. Wind howled against the canopy. The instruments rattled. In those moments, the Thunderbolt was less a machine and more a beast, heavy, unstoppable, trembling with raw energy. Many pilots said the same thing. The jug would bring you home. It could take incredible punishment. Flak holes in the wings, oil leaking from the engine, half the tail shot away, and still climb. A few even landed with cylinders missing or fuselages torn open. One squadron joked that you could fly a P-47 through a brick wall and still make it back for dinner. But there was nothing funny about what they saw below. The attacks on German convoys were devastating and personal. Pilots often recognized the same roads they'd bombed days earlier, now filled again with new trucks, new soldiers, new targets. It was a grim cycle. "You didn't think of faces," one pilot said years later. "You just saw movement, and you fired." The emotional weight of these missions grew heavier as the months passed. Letters from home were filled with pride. "You're helping end the war." But the pilots felt something darker. They were fighting an enemy who could no longer fight back. Many described an odd mix of satisfaction and sorrow. The satisfaction of surviving, the sorrow of what survival required, precision and punishment. By this stage of the war, the Thunderbolts' tactics had evolved into science. Ground controllers coordinated targets with pinpoint accuracy. Columns spotted by reconnaissance aircraft were marked for immediate destruction. Pilots were trained to approach from the sun, strike in pairs, and escape low through valleys to avoid radar. Fuel dumps, rail yards, ammunition depots. Nothing was safe. German logistics collapsed. Supply trains burned for days. Communication lines were shredded. The P-47, with its speed and payload, had become an airborne artillery battery. A weapon of strategy, not just destruction. Even German officers began to acknowledge its dominance. A captured Wehrmacht colonel reportedly told interrogators, "When we hear the Thunderbolts, we stop. It means death is near." The Luftwaffe, crippled by losses and fuel shortages, rarely appeared to challenge them. When it did, the outcome was brutal. The P-47's dive speed and rugged frame gave it an edge in vertical combat. Pilots learned to use the boom and zoom, diving fast, firing once, and climbing back before the enemy could react. It was efficient, deadly, and left little room for mercy. In one encounter over the Seine, a Thunderbolt pilot shot down 2 Focke-Wulfs in under 30 seconds. His report was short. "They turned. I didn't." That was the new philosophy of air warfare. Precision over pursuit. Results over duels. The age of romantic dogfights was ending. The age of industrial air dominance had arrived. The moment of realization, the climax of the Thunderbolts campaign, didn't come with a single explosion, but with silence. After Falaise, after the Seine, after weeks of relentless attacks, there were no more convoys left to destroy. The roads that once glowed red with burning trucks were empty. The sound of engines faded. In that silence, many pilots finally understood what they had done, and what it meant. They had broken not just Germany's supply lines, but its will to fight. One flight leader from the 56th Fighter Group wrote in his diary, "We've killed the war's heartbeat. Everything below us has stopped moving." That line would later be quoted in military reports analyzing the success of the air campaign. It captured the essence of modern warfare: victory through paralysis. The P-47 had started the war as an escort fighter, built to protect bombers. But by the summer of 1944, it had transformed into something entirely new: a weapon of dominance that erased the boundaries between air and ground, soldier and pilot, machine and man. Legacy of fire as the Allies pushed toward Germany. The Thunderbolts followed. Town after town fell. Bridges collapsed under rocket fire. Tanks burned on the Autobahn. The Germans called them Jabos, short for Jagdbomber, hunter bombers. The name stuck, carrying both fear and respect. Even seasoned panzer crews admitted that once the Jabos arrived, their fight was over, and in every mission debrief, every combat log, one truth echoed again and again. The P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than an airplane. It was a symbol of unstoppable force, of how air power had reshaped the very nature of war. The firestorms it unleashed across France were not the end, but the beginning of a new kind of warfare. One where victory was earned not by numbers or ground alone, but by control of the sky above it. And from those burning valleys of France, that truth would carry on, into Germany, into the future, into every war that followed. The shattered arteries of the Wehrmacht. By September 1944, the German army in Western Europe was not retreating in order. It was disintegrating. Supply lines that once stretched confidently from the Rhine to Normandy now lay in ruins. The once proud machine of German logistics, its trucks, depots, trains, and bridges, had been severed by air power. At the center of that destruction was the P-47 Thunderbolt. From dawn to dusk, formations of these aircraft hunted the remnants of an army on the run. Roads that had served as the veins of the Wehrmacht became graveyards of twisted steel and blackened rubber. Charred fuel drums lined the roadsides, and the smoke from burning convoys hung over France like a second sky. Intelligence reports from the Allied air forces in late August were blunt. German motorized transport had suffered irrecoverable losses. In some sectors, entire battalions were immobilized not by enemy troops, but by the absence of gasoline and ammunition. The Luftwaffe's failure to contest the air meant the Allies could strike at will, a luxury the Germans had never known. The Thunderbolt's dominance in this new form of warfare was both strategic and psychological. American ground troops advancing through France often found wreckage still smoldering, proof that their air cover had been there only hours before. Pilots and infantry developed a quiet bond built on mutual reliance. One soldier recalled, "When we heard those big engines overhead, we knew we weren't alone anymore. The sky was ours." For the Germans, the effect was the opposite. Every open road felt like a death sentence. Commanders began issuing orders to move only at night. Convoys that once traveled confidently in daylight now hid beneath forests and barns, terrified of the sudden shriek of diving thunderbolts. Even the most hardened panzer units learned fear. Heavy tanks like the Panther and Tiger, once symbols of German invincibility, were left abandoned in fields after running out of fuel. They were useless without the logistics that sustained them. Logistics now obliterated by air power. Numbers that told the story between June and September 1944. The U.S. 9th Air Force reported destroying over 12,000 vehicles, 4,000 locomotives, and countless smaller targets. More than 4,500 sorties were flown by P-47 units in August alone. In 1 week of concentrated attacks near Argentan, American pilots claimed over 1,500 trucks destroyed, nearly an entire corps' worth of supply transport. These were not inflated numbers from propaganda offices. They were confirmed through reconnaissance photography. Burned-out convoys stretching for miles, entire towns reduced to depots of twisted metal. The images became a grim visual map of how air power had replaced artillery as the decisive weapon of war. At Eisenhower's headquarters, analysts began referring to the Thunderbolt as the hammer of logistics. The term stuck. Generals who once measured success in ground miles now measured it in tons of fuel destroyed, trains derailed, or bridges collapsed. This new reality redefined the way wars would be fought. Mobility, the essence of modern warfare, had become a liability under total air dominance. The German realization captured German officers described the experience in terms that bordered on disbelief. One panzer commander admitted, "We no longer feared enemy tanks. We feared the sound above the clouds." Another, interrogated in September, said simply, "Your planes didn't just destroy our trucks. They destroyed our ability to hope." The Wehrmacht's strategy of rapid counterattacks and mobile defense depended entirely on the ability to move. Once the Thunderbolts cut that movement off, resistance became static. And static defense against Allied firepower was suicide. By the time the Allies reached the borders of Germany, the Luftwaffe had been reduced to a token force, its pilots inexperienced and its fuel nearly gone. American pilots began to refer to the final missions of 1944 as cleanup runs. The great battles of movement had ended. The destruction was complete. In those final weeks before winter, the P-47 had done more than win control of the sky. It had rewritten the logic of modern warfare, proving that dominance above could dictate victory below. A new blueprint for victory by winter, 1944. The Allied High Command had learned a profound truth. One written not in theory, but in the wreckage of Europe's roads. Air superiority was no longer a support function. It was the foundation of victory itself. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven this beyond doubt. It was no longer just a fighter, nor even a bomber. It had become the hinge upon which all ground operations turned. Whenever the U.S. Army moved, the Thunderbolts were already ahead, cutting off retreat, strangling supply lines, and clearing paths for armored divisions to roll through. Commanders like Omar Bradley and George Patton began to coordinate directly with Thunderbolt groups. Communication lines linked tanks to pilots in real time, using forward air controllers on jeeps and hilltops. The result was revolutionary. An integrated battlefield where air and ground worked as one. Patton, famously impressed by the aircraft, called the P-47 "my flying artillery." In after-action reports, he credited it for saving thousands of men and shortening the campaign across France by weeks. To him, the Thunderbolt was not an accessory to victory. It was victory. On the German side, captured reports confirmed this view. The Wehrmacht's General Staff, once confident in its mechanized precision, now described the air situation as catastrophic. They noted that even well-planned counterattacks were impossible under constant strafing and bombing by enemy fighter bombers. In simple terms, every road, every bridge, every movement risked annihilation. The psychological collapse. What followed was more than a military breakdown. It was psychological. The presence of the Thunderbolt instilled a permanent state of dread among German soldiers. Survivors of convoy attacks described their fear not as battle shock, but as helplessness. "We could not shoot back," said one captured driver. "We only waited for the next pass." German morale in the West plummeted faster than in any previous phase of the war. Even elite SS units began abandoning equipment to avoid being spotted from the air. Reports circulated of soldiers hiding in rivers or drainage ditches when they heard the distant roar of radial engines. Whether or not planes were actually nearby, the sound itself had become a weapon. Meanwhile, among American pilots, pride grew quietly but deeply. The Thunderbolt had earned its place among legends, not through elegance, but through endurance. It was a brute of a plane, built like a tank, and flown by men who trusted it with their lives. The end of an era as the war in Europe drew to a close. The P-47's dominance began to fade, not through failure, but through evolution. Newer aircraft like the P-51 Mustang, lighter and longer-ranged, took over escort roles deep into Germany. Yet, the Thunderbolt's legend endured among those who fought closest to the ground. When Allied troops liberated POW camps and occupied German towns, they saw firsthand the effects of their air war. Roads filled with destroyed convoys stretched for miles. Bridges lay in rivers. Entire railway networks had been erased. In many villages, the locals spoke of the silver monsters that had appeared in the sky before liberation, the Thunderbolts. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, this campaign became a case study in modern warfare. The success of the P-47 informed the design of post-war jets and doctrines that would dominate Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The lessons were clear. Control the sky, and the ground will follow. Even decades later, historians continued to cite the P-47 as the aircraft that bridged the old world and the new. Between fighter aces of dogfights past and the era of precision, industrial warfare. An unbroken legacy. When the war finally ended in May 1945, thousands of Thunderbolts stood lined up on European airfields. Some were flown home, others scrapped. A few left abandoned where they had last fought. Yet among the pilots and ground crews who had served with them, the memories endured. One veteran put it simply, "It wasn't the prettiest plane, but it was the one that brought you home." For the Germans, those same memories were written in fear and respect. They would later admit that it wasn't the Sherman tank or the B-17 bomber that broke their will. It was the relentless, unending roar of the Thunderbolt overhead. The battlefield had changed forever, and in the wreckage left behind, one truth remained: whoever owns the sky owns the war. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world that emerged was not the same one that had entered the war. The landscapes of France, Germany, and beyond still bore the scars of the Thunderbolt's fire. Roads torn apart, bridges twisted, fields of blackened steel. Yet behind that destruction lay something larger than ruin, a lesson that would define modern warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt had shown that strength was no longer measured by how many tanks rolled across a field or how far an army could march. Power had shifted upward, into the clouds, into the roar of engines that decided battles long before soldiers met, face to face. For America, the Thunderbolt became a symbol of ingenuity and endurance. It was not graceful, but it was unstoppable, a reflection of the nation that built it. Where others relied on precision or elegance, the U.S. relied on resilience, production, and overwhelming capability. The Thunderbolt embodied that spirit. To the German soldier, it was a nightmare that came without warning. To the American pilot, it was a guardian that could take a beating and still bring him home. To historians, it remains the machine that bridged two eras, the end of romantic air duels and the beginning of total air supremacy. Even in peace, its echo endured. Jet engines would replace propellers, and missiles would replace bullets. But the principle the Thunderbolt taught never changed. Victory belongs to those who control the sky. And so, in every roar of a modern fighter, in every strike that begins from far above, there is a trace of the P-47, the aircraft that turned the tide of war not through beauty, but through unbreakable power. The German convoys that once filled the roads of France are long gone, but their memory remains, a silent testament to the moment when thunder ruled the heavens, and the world learned to fear the sound that followed.